Payton McCarty-Simas, and I am here today with Eleanor Johnson about her wonderful new book, Scream With Me: Horror Films and the Rise of American Feminism, 1968 to 1980. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for being here too. This is very exciting.
So I'm really excited to talk about this book, and we said it just before we started recording, but there's a lot of overlap between your book and its origins and the book I just wrote. But something that struck me right away was that you said your point of entry into the subject of horror and second wave feminism was the experience of watching Rosemary's Baby in the context of Dobbs and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Can you talk to me about how that inspired you and what your methodology was building out from there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what happened was I was co-teaching a class called The History of Horror in 2022, and it was a big sweeping history. It went from 1321 when Dante, finished the Inferno to the modern day. So it was like 700 years of horror. And it just so happened that I taught the Rosemary's Baby lecture the day before the reversal of Roe was leaked. And I obviously didn't know that was coming. And the way I read the film was that it's kind of a parable about the dangers of denying women reproductive agency and reproductive autonomy. And I think in that regard, it's a very, very interesting work because it's playing with the actual limit case of the pro-life position. In that, oftener than not, not always, but oftener than not, people who are adamantly pro-life are also Christian. Right. So here we have Rosemary who gets raped by Satan and is pregnant with the Antichrist. And there's no way that any Christian person could root for her to keep that particular pregnancy because doing so entails wanting the birth of the Antichrist. So I read the film as like a very sophisticated meditation on what the limits were of being sort of pro-life. And I talked a lot about the dynamics by which Rosemary was enforced into the situation she finds herself in. So the rape, sure, but also the chronic gaslighting by her husband, Guy Woodhouse, played by John Cassavetes, and by her neighbors, and the collusion of the doctors who are around her, manipulating her, undermining her sense of reality, sort of eroding her social contacts with other people. So I read the whole film in those terms, and it was a great lecture. Like when a lecture really lands, you can feel it, and it really landed. And then the next day, the Roe reversal was leaked, and so my students got all activated about it. I got all activated about it. We had extra sessions to talk about it. And then the following year, I had a sabbatical, and so I thought, like, all right, I have tenure. I've written some books on medieval stuff, which is my own training. I'm a medievalist by training. And I thought, I'm going to try and write an article about Rosemary's Baby. So I was writing an article about Rosemary's Baby, and as I was doing that, I started to wonder, was this the only film with a sort of like covert feminist agenda going on in the period? And almost as soon as I asked myself the question, the clear answer was no, right? Because, The Exorcist, which is the second film I talk about in detail in Scream With Me, The Exorcist is really trying to think through the idea of domestic violence in a moment before that term even existed in American public discourse to describe the ways in which women were imprisoned in their own homes with their children by demonic male forces who wanted to sort of extract obedience and servitude and various other kinds of things from them. And once I thought about The Exorcist, I started thinking about other films as well. And so the six canonical films that wound up in the book are Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, the original Stepford Wives, The Omen, Alien, and The Shining. And so those are my kind of six witnesses to this phenomenon in the 1970s, although I do kind of follow it through a little bit into the 2010s. And also, kind of especially, the last chapter is about the three reboots, remakes, prequels, sequels, etc., of some of the original six movies that were made in 2024. So the movies Immaculate, The First Omen, and Apartment 7A. And I literally, like when I was wrapping up what I thought was going to be the final form of the book, I heard that a prequel of Rosemary's Baby was going to be released, and I was like, stop the presses. I should probably see that film before I wrap the book. And then I found out that The First Omen was coming out. So the last chapter was one of those sort of rare instances when reality comes and meets you at the doorway of your own project. And that's why I wrote the last chapter that way. So that's kind of how the project evolved.
I mean, yeah, it's both bleak and magical when things like that happen, where
Yeah.
the universe is just giving you the solid of validation in that way.
Yeah.
Especially since Immaculate and The First Omen came out on the same weekend.
Right.
Which amazing. So I do want to talk about The Exorcist, but I want to just start out by saying, yeah, you're an English professor and a medievalist by training.
Mhm.
You've written poetry, which is amazing. But one of the questions I had was, how did you find it writing about film in depth in this way? Was there anything that surprised you as you shifted registers into the history of film, or?
Definitely. To give you a little context, when I was in graduate school, I worked as a research assistant for another medievalist named Carol Clover, who also, of course, wrote Men, Women, and Chainsaws. So I come from kind of a lineage of
Nice.
medievalists who like moonlight as horror people.
Yeah.
And the reason I started teaching my history of horror class, the kind of 700 years of horror, was because my co-teacher, a man named Jeremy Dauber, heard that I had published writing on horror in the Middle Ages. And so he asked me if I wanted to do anything with that. So it seems like a huge jump from medieval to horror cinema, but the jump wasn't actually as big to me as
Mm,
it might read to be to someone else. And the other thing I would just note before I answer your actual question is that American horror, especially like classic horror, often has, and I don't talk about this in the book, but often has kind of like a medieval deep psyche to it. So, like the violation of Catholic religion often shows up in American horror. Various kinds of like inquisitorial dynamics often show up in American horror. Witchcraft stuff routinely shows up in American horror, as you know probably better than I do. So, the medieval to horror bridge is like a bigger, sturdier, more robust, and actually shorter
mm,
bridge than we might think it is. And I mean, to really bear that out, look no further than Game of Thrones, which was like the fantasy medieval zombie horror mega hit of the last, when did that come out even? 15 years, say. So that's kind of just to note that the jump between medieval and horror is not that big. But to your actual question, what was it like for me to start working on film? Because that was kind of new. I had written in 20, well, it got published in 2018. I wrote a book called Staging Contemplation, which is about drama in the Middle Ages. And in order to write that book, I had to learn to think about how philosophical ideas got imagined, shaped, and mobilized on the stage. So, how they went from being treatises on God, that was what this book was about, how they went from being like texts that were written for people to read to being performances that were public and intended to be consumed at large scale. And so, that mental habit of shifting from like a philosophical idea to a filmic or to a dramatic idea, I had spent a lot of time thinking along those times prior. So then the part that was really new was thinking about cinema per se rather than drama writ large. And, as I don't need to tell you, there are very important shifts of dynamic, right? Like there's the whole idea that in any given performance, like it could be different every time, and a film is the same every time. There's infinitely more wealth that gets poured into the American cinema industry than ever was poured into a medieval drama at any moment in any time in the past. And then, you have to think about stuff like sound design, special effects, blocking. Like there's a lot more capacity to fine tune, in particular, kind of the affective register of a film. So, like what a person is paying attention to and how they're coached by the dynamics of the film to feel about it. That's something that filmmakers have far more control over
mm,
than dramatists do, where they're working with a staged production. Because, like, for just to stick with Rosemary's Baby for a second, if the director of that film, Roman Polanski, wants us to look real close up at Rosemary's face, he can make us do it, right? He can just zoom tight in on her face. Playwrights can't do that, right? Dramaturgs can't do that. You can't force somebody to look at a particular thing in a dramatic work. You can encourage it, but you can't actually make the audience do it. So there is a possibility in cinema for much more directive kind of channeling of thought and affect than I think you find in other dramatic forms. So I had to learn to work with that and also to think critically about it.
mm,
And I also, as a medieval, when I was studying drama in the Middle Ages, I never knew who the authors were who wrote these things. Medieval dramas were generally written collaboratively. The notion that they even were directed by a single director is probably totally fictitious and ahistorical.
mm.
And the situation's obviously completely different in a work like, again, for just as an example, Rosemary's Baby, where we know who wrote it, Ira Levin,
Yep.
know who directed it, the infinitely problematic Roman Polanski.
Yeah.
And so you can make different kinds of assumptions or ask different kinds of questions about kind of what the intention of the project was when you're talking about like discrete individuals than you can when you're talking about a literary work that was probably written collectively over the course of many decades and probably was never played exactly according to the script anyway. So I had to kind of shift competency a lot there. And I also had to learn how to work with reviews of film, right? Because as a medievalist, one of the things that we medievalists tend to grieve is the general lack of historical responses to works of art, right? I don't know how, you know, Maud McPherson living in medieval York felt about the medieval drama she saw, but I do know how a lot of reviewers felt about Rosemary's Baby. I do know how a lot of people felt about The Exorcist, which is a fascinating sub-narrative unto itself. I
Mhm.
do know how like feminist critics felt about The Stepford Wives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's like a whole additional archive for assigning meaning to a film that you can't use in certainly in my earlier period. In some earlier periods you can, but not in the Middle Ages.
Something you said struck me that I wanted to get to later, but I guess I'll just do it now, is the question of authorship in these films. It's
Mhm.
something that I think, particularly in horror, which is such a space of reclamation and contestation and oppositional viewership, you
Mhm.
do run into a myriad of deeply, endlessly problematic filmmakers. And you chose in this book to contend with that in a head-on way,
Mhm.
which was really striking. So what was it? Why did you think it was important to feature a section on the directorial malfeasance of people
Yeah.
like Roman Polanski?
The bad men making good movies section. Yeah.
Yes.
The reason is that I wanted to argue and feel really strongly that Rosemary's Baby is a feminist film that's making a feminist argument, but I don't want to assign responsibility for that feminism to Roman Polanski, even though interestingly, he did claim to be a feminist, right? Like at around this time period. But I think and trust that we all know that one can claim to be something while in fact being opposed to that thing, as he apparently was. So I didn't want people to come away from reading my book thinking I was saying this film is feminist and therefore the person who made it was a feminist. Right.
Right.
And I also, so that was one reason I wanted to come at it head on. And the other reason I wanted to come at it head on actually has a lot to do with my being a medievalist. So I am an American. I'm from New York. I'm like a pretty diehard feminist. And I study on purpose a historical period in which almost everyone I read is a dead white Catholic male who, oftener than not, didn't really like women very much. So, why do I do that? This is a question I get from my students all the time. And the answer is that sometimes people who don't agree with you make work that's really, really powerful. And sometimes men who are uh, prejudiced in certain ways, sexist in certain ways, nevertheless manage, despite all of our expectations, to produce work that's incredibly empathic toward and layered about their representations of women. And so I come to everything I do with the presupposition that we shouldn't sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. We shouldn't assume that like because person X is bad, all of their work should be discarded. And
Mhm.
so when I realized I wanted to do a book on this topic, and when I realized that half of the bench of directors that I look at were people that I would like probably not want to have coffee with, okay, to put it very mildly,
Mhm.
I realized I needed to deal directly with that problem and to have kind of a statement of principle about the question, right? And to point out that we do live in a world of extremely uncomfortable paradox sometimes, and that there are instances in which predatory, cruel people produce work that sensitively and empathogenically depicts the very people that they are predatory and sadistic toward. That
Mhm.
doesn't feel good. We don't want that to be true. But if we pretend it isn't possible, then we don't look at the work. And that, for me, is a privation that we shouldn't have to endure.
Absolutely. This is a question that comes up with my book all the time too. And for me, the way I've kind of come at it, because I didn't choose to address it the same way you did, I think part of it for me is that when you're working in horror as a genre, the expression of a fear
Mhm.
can be a feminist expression. If it's a masculinist anxiety about women's power or the potential for women to have power, then that can be kind of paradoxically a very feminist action that comes from a very anti-feminist place. Uh,
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of putting it too. A very similar idea. Yeah, I
yeah.
agree with that.
So let's get back to the bigger picture of this book. You're talking about something you called domestic horror in a very particular and specific way, which I thought was super fascinating because there are broader definitions of, domestic horror from like Vivian Sobchak or whoever else. So how did you come to your definition of domestic horror?
It was really an emergent property of just sort of zeroing in on the films that I wanted to talk about. So once I realized, like, okay, this film has to do with this time period and this body of law, and so does this, and so does this, and what do they all have in common? Like, what are the characteristics that make me sort of know intuitively these films are having some kind of a conversation with each other? And
Mm,
there were a few very stably held traits that kind of persist across all of the films in the book, but particularly the original six between 1968 and 1980 that I realized were sort of like I deductively realized were constitutive of the way that I'm thinking of domestic horror in there. The other thing I would say is that I made a decision pretty early on that I wanted to see how and whether and to what extent horror films were like thinking through like actual substantial legal changes that were going on very publicly
mm,
in mainstream America's radar in the period. And so as I was screening the films and thinking about them, I immediately obviously knew that Roe v. Wade was critical, right? So any film that seemed to be talking to Roe v. Wade was going to make my initial cut of possible relevance. Um, the other body of law that I knew I was interested in was the emergent law about domestic violence and also the increasing social awareness in the period that domestic violence, then called wife battery, was a real serious problem that people, families, states, institutions, communities, the federal government needed to care a lot more about and do more about. And so I wanted to look at domestic violence, and in particular, I wanted to look at domestic violence in relation to reproductive harm, because
mm.
I know from activist work that I do now that they are very intimately connected. They're almost always very intimately connected, reproductive or sexual violence and domestic violence, or what was called wife battery. And I could see that that was like at the core of Rosemary's Baby. So I wanted to kind of thread that through the other works as well. And then the third body of law that I knew I wanted to at least think about and see if there were any films that contended with it was the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which I find the history of the Equal Rights Amendment is totally fascinating,
Mhm.
persisting up to today, because, in 1973, it really looked like the ERA was going to pass. Like when it initially went through Congress, it looked like it was just going to be a slam dunk. And then the rest of the 1970s, particularly the fulcrum year is really kind of 75, states started to rescind their approval of the ERA. So why does that matter? Well, it means that American women and men, but for the moment, let's focus on American women and their experience, because historically we haven't focused on it enough. American women were like reading the paper and seeing like, oh my God, I'm about to have equal rights. This is amazing. Oh, wait, no, I'm not. Oh my God, no, I am, because this other state ratified it. Oh, but these other states decided to rescind their ratification. So the emotional experience of American women between about 73, 75, and 80, right, really 82, but 80 is when I stopped the book, was one of the lure of equal rights being constantly held in front of their faces and then jerked away. And so I looked for films that had like a profound ambivalence about the question of whether women were or could be made equal in the eyes of the law to men. And the most obvious one there is The Stepford Wives, the 1975 Stepford Wives, because that film, also based on an Ira Levin novel, takes sort of American feminism really, really, really head on
Mhm.
and thinks through many things, one of which is Betty Friedan's argument in The Feminist Mystique, sorry, the feminine mystique. I wish it were the feminist mystique, but the feminine mystique, where she's talking about essentially how women leave the city, go to suburbia, get domesticated, and kind of wither on the vine. That film is, in effect, a dramatization of that thesis. Interestingly, Betty Friedan hated that film and thought it was like spoofing feminism, even though the filmmakers and the cast were all like, no, 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 we very consciously are trying to spoof the men.
Betty
But
Friedan just hated fun.
yeah, right. And so I knew I wanted that film to be in there. And then I kind of went through and looked for other films that would deal with reproductive violence, domestic violence, and the question of equal rights. And these were the six that I landed on. I also made a choice early on, and I mean, given infinite time, I would want to write a sequel on how this all went down in B movies. But in this book, I made a very deliberate choice only to pick films that had like broad cultural appeal, films where I could confidently say like, yep, people were aware of this movie. You know, even if people didn't go see The Exorcist, I think it'd be hard to find someone in 1973, 74 who didn't know about The Exorcist, right? So I
Mhm.
tried to only pick films that were big budget, splashy, relatively commercially successful films.
That makes sense. Because when I was reading it, the one film that I wanted to ask you about specifically that isn't in this book is The Entity from
Oh,
1982.
I haven't seen that.
Oh, it was deeply controversial. It's about a woman being sexually assaulted by a ghost and no one believing her. And it was discussed in that context, but you might find it interesting. But
Yeah, I'll check it out. There was one other movie that I at some point did think about putting in there is the profoundly weird 1976 film Embryo,
yeah,
but I decided it just didn't have the cultural pull
sure.
of the other films, and it would have seemed, I think, like kind of like a thin witness to the phenomenon in comparison to the others.
In terms of totemic texts that you read in interesting ways, I want to talk about The Exorcist in particular. Um,
Mhm.
you read that film basically in reverse to how I read that film in my book, in a way that I think is really compelling and unique. So when did you decide that you were going to read The Exorcist in this kind of reclamatory way? Because generally speaking, everybody reads that movie as a conservative film.
Right. And I mean, Friedkin himself reads it as a conservative film. So I was watching that movie once and I paused it, right? But just like to go get don't even remember what, but like I went to like go get a soda or something. And I paused it right at the scene when Ellen Burstyn's about to meet with Father Damien. So when I came back into the room, I saw this still image of her with the trench coat on and the collar turned up and the scarf on her head and the huge, huge glasses. And I was like, huh, she looks like a DV victim.
Mm,
And then I like hit play. I hadn't seen the movie in a while. I hit play, and like 30 seconds later, she pulls off the glasses, and there's this massive facial contusion
mhm,
underneath her eye and across her cheekbone. And I thought, oh, this film was representing one of the sort of fundamental unsayables of the 1970s, which is that women were getting the shit kicked out of them in their own homes,
mm,
and nobody was there to help them except maybe the clergy, and they were unreliable. And I already knew a lot about this phenomenon and about the history of domestic violence criminalization in the United States from other work I had done. And in The Exorcist, once you see that dynamic there, you can't unsee it. And
mm.
of course, as someone who studied art in a lot of different periods, particularly the Middle Ages and now, but periods in between too, it's important to remember that like, and I'm sure I'm not trying to mansplain this to you, I'm just saying it in general. Works can very loudly and strongly advocate in multiple directions at the same time.
Mhm.
So, like, do I think William Friedkin sat down and was like, I'm going to make a film that highlights the horribility of domestic violence? I don't. I think he was probably like, I mean, we have reason to assert that he took some kind of at least aesthetic satisfaction in being able to hurt Ellen Burstyn and Linda Blair,
Well, he
right?
slapped the priest in the face on that set.
Yes, and like Linda Blair sustained spinal injuries. Ellen Burstyn was like on crutches at a period. I don't think you do that if you are actively trying to be opposed to domestic violence. But I also think, and this is sort of, another core principle for me as like a literary scholar, the meaning of a work is never fully irreducible to any one person who's responsible for making it. So
Mhm.
did Friedkin like make an anti-domestic violence aria? No. Was he kind of the vehicle through which an anti-domestic violence aria got made? Ironically, yes.
Mm.
And so that was kind of how it happened for me that I started to see the film that way. But I do also think, and I do talk about this in the chapter, the ambivalence is pervasive in the film, right? Like Ellen Burstyn kind of gets punished because she's a wealthy, highly successful professional single mother during a time period in which that was absolutely not a comfortable social position to occupy in the United States, right? Like if you go, and I've done this, if you go back and look at census data from this time period to see how people voted or how people felt about the like equal rights for women, many people who wanted equal rights for women or who would say in the US Census that they supported equal rights for women would also say they didn't support women working outside the home.
Hmm.
So the fact that the film like targets and punishes the Ellen Burstyn, the Chris character, for being what she is very conservative. It's like a shrill anti-feminist, vitriolic, nasty move. It does, however, do us the service of highlighting a reality of the time period, which is that women who stuck their necks out often did get slapped down, whether by a domestic partner or an employer, or who knows what. It wasn't like easy or obvious to be excellent and dominant and a single parent in that time period. So I totally agree with you that that film is conservative. At the same time, it's making a, I think, very full voiced and powerful critique of domestic violence, even if that critique primarily consists in just the exposing of
Sure.
domestic violence as something, in effect demonic,
Hmm.
right? And to me, that's where the film is most interesting, right? The going line among people who, worked with survivors of what was called wife battery was that women were asking for it. Women who were beaten by their husbands were masochists who were asking for it and or who were provoking the men, and that the men should be given like a certain amount of sort of sympathetic understanding. Maybe they had lost a job, maybe they had had a bad day, maybe this, maybe that. And what's nice about The Exorcist is it makes the abusive male entity in the household unequivocally bad. There is no room to have compassion for the demon. And by the end of the film, I think it's really hard to blame Chris for what's happening to them. Early on in the film, I have to imagine that there were some viewers who like saw her get slapped around and were a little bit like, oh, she deserved it. She swears a lot and she flirts with everyone and she's kind of like cold and whatever other, sexist thing they might have thought about her. By
Hmm.
the end of that film, I think it's really hard to feel anything other than I want her and I want Regan, Linda Blair, to get out of there. Right. And I think that's where the feminist critique in the film is the most robust.
Yeah, that's just so cool and powerful as a reading. I really enjoy that. And it speaks to the broader thing in the book, which is more than anything else, this is a book about representations of domestic violence and the history of that legislation in particular.
Mhm.
And in one of your chapters, there are two that stand out in that department. The section on The Shining, I think, was definitely my favorite part of this book.
Oh, great.
Really beautiful and compelling, the way you talk about it. And I'd love to hear more about that, your perspective on The Shining, which is such a clear
Yeah.
film, but in a meta sense, the way Shelley Duvall was treated is so, yeah, so it's fascinating.
Yeah, that chapter really was one of those. I'm sure you've had this experience too. Sometimes you'll be working on a topic of study or like some research project you're exploring, and you'll have a really good idea of what's going on from the jump. That was not the case in the Shining chapter. I thought I did. I thought I was like, oh, this is obviously a movie about domestic violence. Duh, not a problem. What ended up happening was every further layer I got down into in the film, the story got more like edgy and complicated and kind of tacky in the sense that it stuck to more and more different things. So initially, I hadn't read the novel, I had only seen the film. When I read the novel, I was like, oh my God, the choices Kubrick made in altering the novel, Stephen King's novel, are really revelatory and interesting.
Mm.
Just for comparison, Polanski made almost not a single alteration to Ira Levin's novel. That's like the script and the novel are extremely close. Not true at all with the novel The Shining and the film The Shining. So
Mhm.
there's lots and lots of changes that are made. And as a medievalist, I spent a lot of time doing source study, like reading the Boccaccio story that Chaucer was riffing on for the Canterbury Tales. So I love doing source analysis. So I spent a long time just getting conversant with the differences between the novel and the movie. So that was new, and it really deepened my sense of what both King's and Kubrick's intervention into representing domestic violence were, because they're a little different. Um, from there, I decided, I like did a reading of the film and I brought in the novel, and then I was like, you know what, I'm going to go look at reviews. And I just, every review I read, my jaw just hit the table, right? Because reviewers were so brutal to Shelley Duvall. And they were brutal to her in ways that, I mean, wouldn't even get close to passing muster, nor should they. Nowadays, they criticized her beauty, her appearance. They called her like weak and worse. I mean, some of the invective that was hurled at her was absolutely astounding, but also really, really interesting, right? Like, why bother throwing that amount of shade on some random scream queen unless you think she's pointing to something really true, really deep, and really dangerous? And so once I had that kind of nut partially cracked, I kind of kept reading and looking at other reviews. I started looking at interviews Duvall had done after the fact, and then I started watching like the making of The Shining, directed by Vivian Kubrick of all things, when she was, I think, 17.
Mhm.
And so there's just that film has an enormous amount of kind of paratextual material that you can get into to give the film extra dimensionality, not just the novel, but also the reviews and the making of and the interviews by Duvall. There's just a lot to work with. And as I kind of like dug deeper and deeper, my sense of what was at stake in the representation of domestic violence got more and more, at least to me, complex and interesting.
We only have about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
So I'm going to pivot to asking you about the present situation. This is a question I get every single time I do an interview about my book. But I'm really curious about your perspective. Where do you see domestic horror going now? Because you highlight really good examples of the kind of feminist interventions into these genres with Apartment 7A and
Yeah.
The First Omen. But at the same time, there are films like The Exorcist Believer that are so obscenely conservative in
I
such
know.
a parodic way. And I personally feel like it's been on the upswing in that department with things like Long Legs and Weapons, which are,
Yeah.
obviously vehicles on their own terms. But how do you feel about where horror is going right now as it depicts women?
Overall, I feel good about it. And the reason I feel good about it, and this is actually where I end Scream With Me, I see more women getting involved in making the films, and that's what I want. So the title of the book, Scream With Me, it's not only meant to sort of be something I imagine the protagonists of the films are saying, like, Mia Farrow being like, "Scream with me as I'm tortured by friggin' John Cassavetes." It's also that I want other creators, I want other content makers, filmmakers, essayists, writers, poets, I don't care what, especially women, to scream their heads off right now because voice appears to be our last and best hope for turning this like extremely scary ship around. So I am optimistic about what horror can do because I think there's a lot of female and or feminist, because the two don't have perfect overlap, of course, filmmakers who are realizing that the horror genre is a really, really important medium to exploit for making trenchant political critiques, right? I think that's acutely true as regards the representation of women. It's also true as regards the representation of minorities, right? Or historically oppressed people. So now I'm thinking of like Jordan Peele, right? Jordan Peele has made some of the most important interventions in the depiction of Black Americans in the last decade, and he's primarily done it through horror, right? And interestingly, he's done it at least in Get Out, in a horror film that riffed on a bunch of the domestic horror films that I talk about in Scream With Me, like Stepford Wives, Rosemary's Baby. So I think that more and more filmmakers are realizing that horror is a very, very profound sort of vector for political critique, whether it's about race, whether it's about class, or whether it's about gender. So you asked about gender. I would like to see more women and more feminist filmmakers making films. I think that is our great hope. And what I expect to see is an increase in body horror. We've already seen it. I think we're going to keep seeing it. I think we're going to see more and more domestic horrors and more horror films that are like variants on the domestic horror. So like the film Heretic from last year with Hugh Grant, that's kind of a variant on the domestic horror. It's a variant in the sense that, the Hugh Grant character and the two girls who get entrapped in his home, they kind of run across each other by accident. It's not like they're married to each other or in a family together. But the result is the same. Because of their status as female, they're imprisoned in the home and subject to torture and, in one case, death. And I expect to see more and more kind of variance on the domestic horror genre as we move forward too, because I think horror is a very powerful vehicle.
Amazing. Eleanor, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's great talking to you.
You too.